We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella, Dei Mater Alma, ad semper Virgo, Felix te porta.
Welcome, everybody. Good morning, wherever you are. Steve with Sense Fidelity. I'm here with second timer, Jeb Smith. Good morning, bud. How you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on again, too.
I'm sorry?
Thanks for having me on again.
Dude, you're welcome. Thank you. The thanks is all on this side of the table, as the Bobs would say. Well, we brought Jeb on for Missing Monarchy a couple months ago, and now he's back for the book that I really caught my eye, Defending Dixie's Land. Now, I'm a good old Southern guy down in grew up in South Carolina, born in Florida, grew up in South Carolina, now live in North Carolina, and Jeb is a Vermonter. So when I heard that, when I started reading, going, wait a minute, this guy's from Vermont. How'd that come about, dude? First off, don't worry, we're doing this live. I know I usually don't do live stuff, but I wanted people to bring questions too. So go ahead, bring the toughest ones you got. Jeb and I can at least answer. And don't worry, there's a reason why it's on a Catholic channel. There's Catholic stuff going to be involved in this. So anyway, first off, Vermont. How? I know Copperheads. If anybody don't know what a Copperhead is, it's someone from the North that's very sympathetic to the South. Great movie, by the way. Go watch it.
Yeah.
How'd you come about this?
It's, I explained a bit in my intro. Growing up in Vermont, you're really not given the Southern perspective in any way. And it's probably more than any other region, New England, I would assume, is pro-North. So you're not going to find any material outside of what's kind of the approved or the standard version of the Civil War within Vermont. Everyone I talked to, all the books through school, normal television, it all supported the Northern view of the war. Of course, I had no idea that's what was happening. I just thought this is the Civil War. This is everything I know about it. And so this is what it must be. And I started, my father actually, so it is connected to the South. My father moved to Alabama for work. And when he was down there, he was introduced to some material you wouldn't find in New England. And so me and him got talking. And it was actually David Barton of Wall Builders. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He does a lot in kind of the Christian history of America and the influences. And he's very strong Republican. He loves Lincoln, pro-North and all that. Uh-huh. And so I started digging into those aspects of our history and learning about kind of the more libertarian and Christian influences on America. And I turned into a conservative Republican and, very patriotic of America today and in our history. And I wanted to defend America and show how great we were as a nation. I was all in, and that the Republican Party was the party of the founding fathers, that it's kind of, it hasn't changed. They're basically the same. And so I mentioned in my intro how slavery is our biggest sin. So I wanted to research slavery and just see what I could find on it, learn more about it. And the first book that I just happened to find on Amazon was Myths of American Slavery. And it was by, I think it was Ron Kennedy. And he wrote from the Southern perspective, and the information in that book I had never heard of. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It really shook me on everything I thought I knew to be true about the Civil War, everything about the founding fathers. And I got The South Was Right, also by him. And that just led to an exploration. I started digging into original sources myself. I started reading books from pro-South authors like DiLorenzo, and libertarian authors especially wrote about American history that I'd never heard before. And a lot of it was about the Southern perspective of the Constitution and the Union. And I started debating online. I went on every forum I could possibly find. I was getting kicked off of all the forums because they're okay with you being pro-South and arguing. But if you start really, taking it to them and exposing a lot of the truths about the Civil War that are hidden, they'll kick you off. Mm-hmm. And it actually led to me writing the book because I was perfectly fine with debating on forums. It was kind of my thing to do. And eventually everyone kicked me off and I had nowhere to vent or to share this information. I'm like, well, maybe I'll write a book. And then I end up, reaching a much wider audience that way and having a large impact. And so I was really digging into original sources. It was reading a lot of libertarian authors and pro-South authors on Amazon and finding books that, you won't find in Vermont, through Amazon and online, and just reading certain authors, being exposed to them, and they talk about other books, and I get those, and it kind of just, one thing led to another, and the conversion happened pretty early on.
Yeah, I did a stint in Colorado for 4 years, moved out there, and I came back to God's country 4 years later, back in 2019. As I say, lived in a foreign land because Southerners, we look at if you look before Lincoln, mm-hmm. You're a Virginian, you're a Carolinian, you're a Georgian. Right. That's your home. That's your patria, your homeland, your country, which it still is. State is synonymous with country. Is your state is right. Carolina. So I go to Colorado. I'm like, I'm in foreign land, and people would ask me questions. Where are you from? And I remember, sure as anything, one lady goes, "Oh, you're from this. You must have owned slaves." Or I would say, "Yes, ma'am," "No, ma'am," "Yes, sir," "No, sir." And somebody goes, "Are you military?" And, "No, I'm Southern." It's a different culture down here. And then, as you said, you brought up slavery thing. Everyone brings up that it's mm-hmm. the only one that can beat over the head. Right. But the myth on that is, they say, and there's other things that no one even brings up. I mean, you right off the bat, you tackled it right in the book. The slave, even I never even read the slave narratives before. That was that an eye-opening thing for you?
Yeah, it definitely was, and that's probably one of the sources I really fell in love with, because I loved hearing the perspective of slavery from the slaves. I had no idea we had all that recorded history, and so when I started digging into that, it was just it felt like I was part of that society, and I got the perspective of the slaves themselves in these different, depending on what state you're reading. And, these trends come out. First off, that's going to shock you, because it's, 75, 80% of it is like, no one would imagine slavery was that sort of system, because we always hear about the worst 10, 15, 20% of slavery. And that's what we think all of slavery is. And just the more and more I read and understood, it's like you have these Christian gentlemen in the South that even in the North said they're very kind people, they're Christian gentlemen, but at the same time, we treat them like they're severe, slave owners to their slaves, mistreat them, or are these horrible people, that they have this kind of contradiction going on. And, the more I read about slavery, the abolitionists from Europe and the Northeast going south and saying, there's not what slavery is like. We've been fooled. It's really political propaganda at the time, and the Republican Party that's using slavery, just as politicians do today. They find a moral issue and they'll use it and try to spin it to get what they want. Like I was watching Trump's inaugural, and, they brought on a woman in sports who faced a transgender man, who's playing on the women's team. He took her out, he tackled her, and she had all these, physical problems for years after, and she went around speaking about it. And that's a horrible thing. And I'm definitely, on Trump's side with that men should not be in women's sport. But they're obviously using this one little moral issue to get their way and to build support for Trump. And Democrats do the same thing. And it's been that way all along. The North, everyone just looks for something, exaggerates it to get their political to get the political advantage. And slavery was just that in its day. The problem is history is only picked up on those political activist versions of history, and the very true small amount of horrible things in the South, and paint the whole of slavery that way. And that's not accurate history at all.
Yeah, you had some narratives like the slaves getting up and singing. They look forward to they going out and working. The entire family, even the masters, were out there working together with each other. And You don't hear about that. Or
Right.
they would take a break between 11 or 2 because it was
Right,
so
yeah.
hot, and they'd go fishing.
Right.
When they name a high school, because someone told me, "Oh, you went to this? You're from a public school." What public school teaches that slaves went fishing in the middle of the day?
Or that, like, the children of the slaves run up to the slave master. They're all excited to see him. He's holding them in their arms, and they're, treats them like their own kids, and there's that loving relationship. I remember the PBS documentary, which I still love. It's a pro-North, Ken Burns. I don't know if you've seen it.
I know of it. I haven't watched it.
It's like, if you can handle watching a pro-North and understand that, it's a great documentary, the way the music's done and everything. But I remember they talked about William Tecumseh Sherman going up to a slave and shaking his hand. This is after the war, and they make this huge deal, like, oh, this has never been seen before. And that's why in my book I quote a lot of observers. This stuff happens all the time in the South. You don't see it in the North, but because they're so common, they live with each other, they interact, that the races are familiar, and there's not that difference like there is in the segregated North. And the slave narratives definitely bring that out. Slaves going and sleeping in the bed with their master or their master's children, and they're more like families, which makes sense when you're living together, and it's not like I'd say modern capitalism where you're working for your boss. It's more of an extended family. You're working together. You're both benefiting each other. And one thing the slave narratives, I don't know if you noticed this, how much freedom. A lot of them didn't interact with their master at all. It was more, kind of self-regulated in a lot of ways. And they didn't have outside government interference and things like that. In many ways, they had freedom that we do not enjoy today, even though they were legally slaves.
Yeah, you bring up in the narratives, one of them goes down and they earned money. Wait, time out. They went down to the store to pick up a fiddle, then go challenge the master to a fiddle contest, and they all had this massive party where they all got together. And these guys would sing and dance and have. Well, Tocqueville writes about that in Contemporaries, as how the races lived in harmony together, and even though the laws were on their side, which you kind of bring up in the when they said they banned some states later on banned education, and the people were like, "Yeah, we're going to ignore it. We're still going to teach everybody."
Right? Yeah.
And then there was a narrative of one former slave saying, "If we weren't set free, you would have seen how much money we would have had."
Well, yeah.
Like, what?
and some of those European observers that came over and talked about what luxury the slaves were dressed in for church and things like that, they were obviously earning their own money on the side. And I had no idea about that either. I thought that you're a slave, everything goes towards your master, but they really kind of just took the tithe off the top of the earnings, and slaves own their own land. So when they wanted to work harder, if they wanted to, they could then sell, the cotton or whatever they're growing to their master or someone else, and kind of have their own business on the side. And that's where they could earn the income. I love that one slave narrative. I don't remember who it was. I think it was an Alabama slave. And he said multiple times his master was low on money. He was, he went to his different slaves and they would lend him money for whatever he needed. And then he'd end up paying them back. But in our mindset, it's like, oh, there's your slave. Just make them work harder, steal their money, whatever there is. They didn't do that. It's complete opposite of what you would learn in school. A master saying, look, I'm in trouble financially. Can I have some of your earnings to borrow and I'll pay you back? Yeah,
they had their own gardens. And their own, and somebody goes, well, they lived in a log cabin. And goes, well, most people lived in log cabins. And,
right.
They mentioned afterwards they had free health care, free clothes, free this, free. They were obviously you were taken care of, because the myth is as you bring up, there was a guy with a whip. They were gonna like in the movie Glory. You see the guy take his shirt off and it's got jabs all over his back and all that. And I think you mentioned it. The people that did that were mostly Northerns because, quote, they didn't live with them before. They weren't used to it. Whereas we down here, we live together. It still is today. If you go up to like Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, one race lives one side, one race my mom's side of family lives in Cincinnati. We'd go up there in the summers when we were kids, and you wouldn't see anybody outside your own race because everyone lived segregated. Down here, we all live together.
Right. Yeah, and there's an image that you'll always see. Well, you're talking about with the slave with marks on his back, and whenever you look up any article online, and they have that kind of one picture of the one guy who's whipped, and who knows if what brought that about. I mean, those things did happen, but as I said, masters were thrown in jail or put to death when they were cruel to their slaves, and it was against the state law that they weren't allowed to use that sort of punishment. And the vast majority of whippings were done by slaves themselves, because the master was generally off-site, and then he'd have one of the slaves be the overseer on the larger plantations, who would do the whipping himself. So it was very rare that whites actually did the whippings. What were we talking about? Something about segregation.
Just the northern cities, how it is up there right now still. And
the Northerners going south. And I think a lot of it is because they got into it for the money, especially after the cotton gin. It's now very valuable to have slaves in cotton plantations. So that's when you get the capitalists, the people who are really, there's a good business opportunity. I'm moving south. Slaves are my employees, and I want the greatest production I can. And I'm going to be severe on them, and I'm going to be a harsh master and push them. Whereas Southerners, they grew up generation after generation with their slaves. As I said, in the slave narratives, it says a lot of times, slaves were their uncles. They were all they knew. They were, there's more blacks on the plantation than there were whites. So these slave children are growing up. Their friends are the kids of the slaves, the younger slaves. Some of the older ones they treat as uncles, and they learn how to fish or hunt from the slaves, and they grow up. They're now the masters of their kids. They're not going to be cruel to these slaves that they've grown up with. They're kind of extended family in a way. So it's a lot more personal. Whereas the Northerners who came south, in the same way that there was cruel, wicked factory owners in the North, I think it's that section of society that moved south said, okay, cotton is where it's going to be. We're going to treat them the same way we're doing factories, and be horrible to them. They would have been cruel in the North or the South. Those sort of people, I think.
Yeah, the only media thing that portrays it I can think of is Mel Gibson's movie Patriot, when they all kind of you see the kids growing up to the mistress, not mistress, the maid at the house, and they're hugging her, and all they're just like they're her own little kids. And
have you seen Gods and Generals?
Oh, yeah.
That's a great movie. I mean, it doesn't really focus on slavery, but that kind of gives the image of an extended family in a lot of ways,
And before people go, hey, they only succeeded because of slavery, the Corwin Amendment is never talked about. Never. I would say anywhere. I was trying to think where would it be? Nobody. Most people probably don't even know what that is. That was the original 13th. And it was done by a guy named Corwin, and Abraham Lincoln was going to say, hey, we want to keep you guys, we're going to keep slaves perpetual. And the South said no. So if the South was leaving because of slavery, they wanted to keep, why would they leave a union that was going to make slavery perpetual? Nothing makes sense, but no one wants to think about it. And then also no one knows about this stuff.
Right. Yeah. And DiLorenzo points out that Lincoln pushed much harder for that amendment than he did the actual one, which he tried to prevent. But I mean, and at the time, no one's attacking slavery in the South where it already exists. The Republicans wanted to keep blacks from going out west. It wasn't like this abolitionist movement we're against slavery. It's that we don't want blacks going into the territories. We want them for free white people. That's why I quote multiple Republican leaders at the time saying we're the white man's party and we're for white labor, free white labor, and we don't want it in competition with slavery. Because at this time, the South is financially the strongest part. They have the best economy, and they're outdoing Northern labor. And they say, we don't want slavery extending and having powerful economic forces that's going to prevent us from doing what we want to do, and it's going to bring blacks with them. Most of the northern states completely segregated blacks from even entering their state. And so, the South.
Indiana, Illinois?
Yeah, Illinois was one of them. Yeah, Indiana. I think there was 10 total. I think I list them.
Yeah, you weren't allowed to vote. You weren't allowed to live there.
You couldn't gather in large numbers. They say that about in the South, but you couldn't do it in Illinois. And Lincoln supported all that when he was in Illinois. But the South had slavery protected. It was for the cotton states, the real issue was, are these territories out west, which most everyone agreed was not going to accept slavery. They didn't have the support for it. But they wanted the states to have the option of choosing. They didn't want the federal government to choose for these states and force one way or the other. And as they said, and that's why I have that chapter on the Union before Lincoln, we can see all the founding fathers, especially Southerners, saying if you allow the government to decide one issue that's outside of what the Constitution allows, they're going to expand it. And they're going to just keep going. And that's why throughout the antebellum period, North and South, states would resist the federal expansion outside of what the Constitution plainly declared. So you had states North and South nullifying federal laws. You have threatening secession. It was actually more common in the North because the federal would try to expand and the states would say, this is not your domain. Well, that's all the cotton states were doing when slavery was an issue, which it was for the cotton states of secession. It was saying these states have the right to decide on slavery. That's not the choice of the federal government. It's the choice of each of these people within the state to decide for themselves. They weren't actually trying to expand slavery because they knew that would just challenge those states' monopoly on cotton. They were fighting for states' rights. But obviously, I spend a lot of time showing, the cotton states left for many reasons. Slavery and the issue over states' rights are intertwined, and it was only one of many for the cotton states to leave the Union.
Tariffs.
Yeah, tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, many people probably don't know, the CSA Constitution outlawed the slave trade, which was still going on above the Mason-Dixon line.
In a lot of states, a lot of the southern states outlawed it before the U.S. Constitution. A lot of southern states did. And at one point, I think it was 70% of the abolitionist groups were in the South. And the South was the main motivator of freeing slaves in their states and looking to abolish slavery as a whole. And then when the northern states started getting really aggressive or certain individuals and igniting violent rebellions in the South, like Nat Turner and things like that, that's when the South said, okay, we have to, be more careful. And they actually went in the opposite direction.
Jefferson brings up that he actually put that as one of the long train of abuses, and it was the northern guys who wanted to take it out of the Declaration.
And because they were making a lot of money off the slave trade. I think it was Providence, Rhode Island, and I think Providence, Rhode Island was the main slave trade port in all of America. The South almost had no boats that could even make the trans. I mean, they were not engaging in the slave trade. It was Northerners who were doing it and then bringing them south.
Obviously, I was glad you brought up the part that, hey, by the way, blacks on blacks. William Ellison was the richest man in South Carolina, a free black man who owned slaves. His kids were in the artillery here in the South. He actually came up with the Confederate money. And then obviously the Native Americans had them. And then obviously there were white slaves. And then obviously then you bring up, was it you or was it Kennedy that brings up that they were happy to leave Africa because if not, they might have been eaten by their other Africans.
No, I don't know if Kennedy does. I know I do. Where there's multiple observers, both slave traders, slaves themselves, and Southerners, that when we think of them coming over, the slave trade was the worst part of slavery for sure. But when they brought them over from Africa, a lot of them were in tears when they were purchased, not because they were upset, because they were happy. They were happy to get out of the slave trade and out of Africa. And I talk about the contentment of slaves who don't look for freedom. Some of those slaves were born in Africa that are still around in 1860. Some of the older ones are still around, or they told stories to their daughters or their sons who spread words to the others, like, this is what we came from in Africa, in pagan Africa, and it was absolutely brutal and horrible. And this is what it's like in America. Our condition has improved drastically. And that alone, I think, produced a lot of contentment for slaves saying, we're happy to be in America and we're not really looking for freedom, because in Africa, I think it's 70% of the continent at one time is a slave. The pagan worldview does not have the idea of abolition. That was a Christian movement. And so it just it's not ingrained in them in the same way it is in America. And at the same time, their lives are more free than we are in so many ways. You mentioned, you don't have to worry about paying bills. You don't have to worry about medical expenses. It's very libertarian in a lot of ways that a lot of whites sought by going westward expansion to get away from the states and the increasing government control, especially after the Civil War. People somewhat flee west to kind of live off the grid in some ways. And the plantation, at least in many instances, was really that sort of lifestyle in a lot of ways. A lot of them, the master wasn't even on site. They're kind of on their own, doing their own thing. And they were not as upset, I guess, or anxious to get out of that system as we portray them.
Well, like you brought up, you try to bring up a modern part, and goes, all right, you get up at what, 6 a.m. You hurry up and get in your car to sit in traffic for an hour and a half to get your owner to work, and you work from
under his. He's watching you all the time. You got to comply with all the regulations. You don't have the freedom of thought, freedom of mind.
Yeah, you get a 15-minute break.
Taxes. You gotta. There's a lot of stuff I think that we deal with in modern life that they did not have to deal with.
Which goes into the different culture. You got the Northeast puritanical work. Money is God. Literally, the South actually said, it goes into the next part of it, that we were fighting communist, socialist, atheists in the North versus the Christian ways in the South, which most people don't know about the 48ers, the revolutionaries in Germany that came over that failed and got into the politics, military of the North, and the GOP, there's actually a book, Red Republicans. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think the Christian side, as somewhat the South was a form of Christendom in some way, and I do think that is true, and they're antagonistic to modernity, which is all what the North represented. And money has a lot to do with it. As you know, from monarchy, in the Middle Ages, which I'd say is the most Christian society, medieval Europe that's existed, money was almost non-existent to the normal person's life. They saw it as greed. It was not. In a capitalist society, we elevate money, especially, I think that came from the North, and the South was very leisure, relaxed, enjoying life more so than just working. Like family and God meant a lot more to them than the secular progressivism that's all about money and centralization and power.
There's some chapters in here I was just photoing and just sending to people going, I mean, obviously, we already got, most of my friends are already Catholic. Right? The guys out of Texas, I don't need to convert them to Catholicism, but they're already in. So now I'm trying to convert them out of the empire love. Not that they don't even know they're empire loving. What's going on in the post-Lincoln era of just what we have now going, guys, embrace what was going. There's a reason why the South is hated by everyone.
Right.
Even family-wise. You don't think about it, that your chapter on women. I mean, I think there was a quote in there going, women are pretty much worshipped in the South.
Right.
You think of all the pulling the chairs out, holding the doors open. You don't see that much in the North. You're equal. You're fighting each other. The TV shows, like you have the boss lady or the movie show the woman kicking the crap out of the guy anymore.
Right.
But South, she was elevated.
Right. And that's the thing, that section on feminism, where I really think it switched around. In the South, they really honored women for who they were as mothers, and that's kind of the ideal situation, the ideal job. I think it was R.L. Dabney that said all of society is structured to prioritize that, to prioritize women, the family, and the education of children. So they honored and held women up for what they did. And in the North, you don't see that at all. Like, you're not important unless you're making money, unless you're working as much as a man. And so that's where the value in the North is found, is again, money. Whereas in the South, it was family. And I think women have always been seen as the center of the family that keeps the family together. Men are more the providers and protectors, but that job of family was given by God as the most vital, the way all of society is supposed to be structured. And I think if you do that, then you're going to honor that position of women. Whereas if your society is structured after making money and progress, you're going to devalue that and you'll only find value with men. I live in Vermont, and this is probably one of the most, it's got to be the most feminist section in society. And so, you'll have some older guys around that will open doors for women. A lot of them will get upset. They'll like, well, you think I'm a woman, I can't open the door? It's like, so what used to be helping out women or honoring them in some way is now seen as sexism. And again, you're more likely to get them upset in Vermont than make them happy.
I've seen that even down here, because there's the Yankee blood, which the Yankee idea is the puritanical mind, not that the geographical ways, but it's we want my mindset imposed on you. Massachusetts people would wake up, I want Georgia to be like us. That's that attitude.
I also think it's a equality. I talked about how the South was hierarchy and the North was equality. And I think when you take equality to its conclusion, you need equality in all things, between men, between women, between all people, which is, you have to have communism. Economic, political equality would be forcing everything on everyone, centralizing all power so everyone's under the same system. That's the only way to be equal. You can't have Texas do its own thing and Vermont do its own thing. You need as much as possible. Everyone is exactly the same. And so I think feminism in some way for sure is just an offshoot of that Northern ideal of equality, which isn't equality at all. It's forced conformity, and it's unequal, but in their mindset it is. And that you should strive for that in all areas of life. So if you say a man is different than a woman, or say Christianity is different than paganism, or whatever it is, that's to be resisted.
It reminded me of the Engels idea of one nation, when it is the whole, when everyone says one nation, guess what? That's an Engels pet dream of his. Mm-hmm. And Red Republicans get into that about all the characters. I can't remember the lady's name. She used to be a diehard Catholic that apostatized after meeting Marx, or was reading Marx, left, and became this blasted feminist right after the 1850s, 1860s.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I think she's from New York, right? Or she moved to New York. Yeah, part of the Seneca movement or whatever.
Can't remember her name. I can see the page and all that.
Yeah.
But and in that chapter on women, you quote Chesterton at length.
I love Chesterton. He's I always say, whenever I think I have something down and I know it, I want to read his opinion on it, if he has one, if he's wrote about it, because he may completely tear it apart and I'll have to piece it all back together again. And I really enjoy him in his writing. But yeah, he wrote some on the women's movement, and I think it, one of the things he pointed out was, even decades after, there's an article in the Washington Post recently, and it said this, and I couldn't believe it had all the material I talked about in that article. And so you're saying how decades after, women still despise the feminist movement, saw as anti-feminist, saw it as degrading to women. They didn't vote. It's not like they were anxious to get the right to vote, as they say. They were completely against degrading women, and that's how they viewed it. And Chesterton talked about it. And I love where he says, these men who are pushing feminism and the right to vote on women, he said they can vote on practically everything except for if women can vote on voting, because he said 90% of them would vote against it and it would never pass. And so it was kind of forced on them. And then, through societal changes and indoctrination, they bought into the whole idea of living like a man and being degraded to Yankeefied men, I think is what I said.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. You have a paragraph. As mothers were removed from the home, children began to be educated and influenced less by parents and more by schools, the media, and the government. The government replaced the family as the most influential shaper of a child's mind, morals, and worldview. And you bring up that before in education, we'll go back to the slaves going, people get upset about, well, they weren't taught this. Well, most people weren't taught that because you were agrarian. You were taught the weather, seeds, how to grow, how to fish, how to hunt. You didn't need calculus.
Right.
Or you didn't need to go to college, or you didn't need a doctorate in basket weaving or whatever it is. Or everyone had the same level of education in a sense. And it was homeschool, really.
Right. Yeah. And also those, when you did have those needs, it was a small section of society that
Right.
engaged in it or learned it. You didn't have everyone try to learn everything. Um, I think a lot of education ends up being a waste of time for a lot of people, and does have some negative effects. At least the way we're doing it today, and our society has changed. I mean, so back then it was a very simple life that you didn't need the education you do today in all subjects. So, very different society
And when you
and different
state
needs.
control the kids, they control the future, and which kind of with the Pledge of Allegiance. How you get people to
Right.
embrace this empire? Well, have them pledge to a flag and a socialist author, and
Right.
we'll get there. We'll change their minds and mush and get rid of the state rights thing and independence. You're going to be a good servant of the state.
It's always the youth are the easiest to influence, and that's why you always see the most progressive ideas go through in government education with the younger and the next generation. And every generation has new things that they're taught and they're supposed to believe, but they always start young. They'll have the biggest influence, which is also why, Karl Marx wanted universal education paid by the state. He said, if socialism is going to work, we need to educate everyone, and we need to start young, and they need to be in school, for long periods of time so that we can train them how to think. And that's why, your intro talks about you are the resistance. Homeschooling is the greatest resistance you can do to the modern society, in my opinion.
And then you get into go back to the money part a little bit later on Men and Money. You're quoting Daniel Hunley back in 1860. The Southern gentleman, even the most assiduous in business, labors only for occupation, his daily toil being his daily pleasure, and not as in busier or more mere money-getting communities, a pain drudgery. He never buries the man in the business, but makes of his business itself his social enjoyment and his true life. These habits of life, in great measure, may be traced to a certain air of gentlemanly and chivalrous character and manner which is so characteristic even of the humbler, though rough diamonds of the race. And in your own words, you bring in, indeed, it seemed to Southerners that the Yankee believed man was put on earth to make money, to be taxed to benefit society.
And I think that's a Puritan worldview. They outlawed leisure and the way they work. They really, God put man in the garden to tend it, and they take that as thinking man is meant to be working almost nonstop in the modern capitalist system, and it's it's very different perspective than the South, as Hudley points out.
Yeah, he had a great line by Hunley after saying, Southerners did not dream of devoting their whole lives all the time to the towns of the base pursuits of riches. And then was it Holcomb? The Northeast loves to make money, the Southerners to spend it.
Yeah. And that's how you can know I'm a Southerner. I'm not a saver. I do like to spend money when I get it. Some people, especially up here, they make money for the purpose of having money, hoarding it. It's like J.R. Tolkien, Smaug the dragon. He was especially greedy, and he'd hoard his coins and he'd protect them. He wouldn't do anything with them. He just wanted that money. And a lot of people up here, they want the number in their bank account, and money is never enough. They're also very stingy. Like they don't want to spend their money. They hoard it so that it's, it's something they hold on to. It's like they covet it. And to me, it's like, what good is money? I don't even like having money around. I don't like thinking about it. It's a means to an end. So if I have money and I need something or I want to get something, well, then I want money, not because I want money, because I want the thing that money can buy in our society. But to them, money's the goal in itself. And I don't understand that. A lot of people have that sickness, but I do not. So
yes, to use the other guy to benefit yourself instead of down here. It's like, how can we benefit each other? How you need this, I need that. How do we, make an accord to work together?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's it. They're always trying to almost trickery. And I hate advertisement because it's really manipulating people into buying things. And I think that's the whole the Northern mindset of, how am I going to make money? They wake up in the morning. What am I going to do? what way am I going to make money? And I don't think that's on the Southerners' mind at all. And I have to say, reading about the South, to me, growing up in Vermont, I've always been a fish out of water. And so as I'm reading this, the differences, some of the differences you're talking about and other ones that I write about, it felt so satisfying to me to feel like I am not this, complete weird guy that doesn't agree with anyone. It's that there's this whole society in the South that I felt 99% of the time I agreed with. And I'd look around in Vermont even before reading on the Civil War, and I'm like, why are these people like this? What kind of mindset is that? And so to learn that not everyone is the way our Yankees are in New England was refreshing to me. And I felt like I had, some friends, I guess, even if historically, but of course, when I go down to the South, I get the same feeling, not to the extent, obviously, of 1860, but I automatically feel familiarity with them that I don't feel up here.
Your book, I think you said your book is #1 in antebellum sales, but if you went outside, if you went to the smaller cities and did a book run, I guarantee every person outside, like I'm in North Carolina right now, outside Charlotte, Greensboro, Raleigh, it would be everyone would have a copy of it. I mean, that's our ways. I mean, outside, when I was in South Carolina, I ran for State House seat 75 in 2010. And people outside Columbia, they still cannot wait to break away. I mean, it's just the big city.
That's great to hear.
Oh yeah, that is great. You get outside the cities, this mindset is still there.
I'm going to start doing some speaking in the South. I'm going to Houston in the summer. I think Charleston, South Carolina, they said, if I'm ever in the area to go down there. Also, beautiful near Atlanta. So you telling me that helps encourage me to do more of that kind of stuff and get the word out, I guess, in the South.
Now, Atlanta's been messed up from carpetbaggers. We'll get into that.
Yeah, well, Wilmington, too, I would say, yes. North Carolina.
Yeah, there was a great line in your opposition from Southerners warning from Dabney and to the Christians about education. Dabney said that allowing the state to educate would eventually convert the youth to atheism, and they would become hostile to Christ. Because education is thus the most powerful ally to humanism, and every American public school is a school of humanism. This is a quote from Potter. What can be a theistic Sunday school meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children to a stem to the tide of the 5-day program of humanistic leanings? That hasn't happened at all, has it?
And I think Potter, I think, was the atheist and Dabney was the Christian. And I put those two quotes together showing both sides saying public education is the way to create a secular society. And Christian and Dabney's obviously saying, don't do this, or we're going to have everyone's going to be, secular. And Potter saying we must do this so that everyone's secular. And yeah, education is the most important thing. That's one of the other things. I look at Christians in Vermont and they don't seem to connect education to church. They have that strict separation of church and state, that church and what you believe is kind of happens in this building here, and you all get together on Sunday, but then you go to public education during the week and you live your secular lifestyle. And, when I was growing up, I grew up in an extended Catholic family, but I was being sent to a public school that was teaching me things that were, leading me, how could you logically be a Christian? And, I walked away from the faith for a very long time. And so, yeah, education is, to me, the most vital thing that controls everything else. It controls politics, which is why women were so honored to raise your kids as moral Christians. That's how if you have a society, you take an island, you throw 1,000 people on there, and you have these great families, these great mothers that are teaching Christianity and morality, I can tell you they're going to have a great society, a great culture, a great free form of governance. You take 1,000 people over here that are atheists, that are raised in the philosophies of Americans' public education, you're going to have a completely different set of laws, morality. You're going to have all these issues that the Christian society won't have. And they all stem from how people are brought up, the culture and the education.
It's only the 10th plank of communism, which you always see a conservative. We got to get more. We just say you're at least 10th communist. It's just at least.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. That's how far we've fallen. I believe I talk about it in some point in the book. Like, you look at the Republican Party today in 1860. I mean, that was very much early communism unfolding in a lot of ways. And so the Republicans today are extremely progressive. It's just we don't notice it because the Democrats today are so much worse in all the West. We don't have a good standard. As I said in the monarchy book, if people knew how people lived under Christian societies in the Middle Ages or the Old South, they would not say that we are free or conservative today. We're both very progressive. One is just worse than the other.
Well, I think it was the Red Republicans. They bring up that socialism and communism are pretty much the same word. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1920s, they changed it because it wasn't getting as popular anymore. So they changed that to progressivism. So now we're progressive. So, yeah, they're progressive. They're still socialist commie. They're just now progressive. So
and pure democracy, they said, is the road to socialism, which leads to communism. So it was just kind of the first step of getting people, first you get them to accept democracy, then it'll go to socialism and communism. And now they're all kind of mixed into one. I think they've all somewhat morphed together into whatever we have going on today. Progressivism, is a wide definition. That is always progressing and changing and seemingly finding more ways to screw things up.
Now more of the outside the 3x5 approved cars, as Dr. Wood says. The treatment of minorities that you bring up, the next chapter, there's about 3 chapters. And Jeb texted me up one time going, you're gonna let me know when you read this one chapter. This isn't it.
I wanted to make sure you got that in the last chapter. And
oh yeah, this isn't it. But it was like, wow. He goes, you just read it. Their clergy, Catholic, bless the Catholics, bless the flags of the Confederate regiments, and their opposition to the federal regime of New Orleans is more uncompromising than any other group. A Richmond editor wrote, Catholic hierarchy of the South were warm supporters of the Southern cause and zealous advocates of the justice upon which the war of defense was conducted. And you had Illinois James McPherson write, the Puritan War against popery had gone on for 2.5 centuries and was not over yet. Hostility to Romanism, as well as rum, remained a subterranean current within republicanism. There was a lot at the South, and you bring this up. Notice Philadelphia Cathedral. You got the glass up high, the windows up high, because they got tired of rocks getting thrown in up there. You didn't hear any of that anti-Catholic stuff in the South. You just hear it up in the North.
Right. And I think that's the live and let live attitude that I talk about in that chapter, how to a large extent, all these other groups, the Catholics, the South, Native Americans, in a lot of ways were that live and let live attitude, but the North has to make everyone like them and what they think is correct. So they cannot tolerate Catholics in their society as well as a Southern who may still disagree, but is more accepting of the Catholic way of life. But at the same time, as I talk about, the Catholic Church at this time is very traditional and it fits in with the Old South. So they have a lot of similarities that make them more willing, more apt to get along, to tolerate, to admire each other even, and to not see the differences that the North does. And so the more different someone is that's in your society, the more apt you are to despise them. And I think politics does that. The North was more democratic. And so you have a threat by outsiders that wouldn't exist in a non-democratic society, such as the Middle Ages, or a more decentralized society. And so I think they saw them, Catholics, more as a threat as well in the North, which caused that antagonism.
I love the Dagger John Hughes quote that you have in here. First, it's a Dagger John Hughes. You didn't put Dagger in there. Referred to abolitionists as red Republicans. Hughes condemned public schools as godless promoters of socialism, red republicanism, universalism, infidelity, deism, atheism, and pantheism. Adam Tate writes, the Catholics and Southern conservatives viewed the North as the locus of American radicalism and took refuge in Jeffersonian conceptions of both the Union and the Constitution.
And that was it. Politically, they had similar opinions as well, Catholics and the South. So that removed any antagonism over politics. That I think in the more progressive North, you had more people not in line with traditional thinking.
Yeah, this is it. It's a great chat. I mean, you bring up Gratian, who wrote Catholic Confederates. I did a show with him long ago, and many people were like just mind blown. It was like, yes.
I love in that chapter. I quote multiple historians on the Jews, on Native American and Catholics, and they all say it's complete opposite of what people have in their mind. That the North or the North was extremely intolerant of all these groups, and the South was much more accepting and more multicultural, and that definitely surprised me, and I'm sure it would surprise anyone who reads the book. That's not familiar with it.
So here's when the Confederacy sent Father John Bannon to Ireland. It was his view that devout Catholics of Europe could find in the Confederacy the remnant of Christendom. Again, no one speaks about that. They want what we have now all over. They go, oh, we need to get back to a Catholic Christendom. We had that. Nobody wants to embrace that. Yeah. They don't. I don't know if it's just ignorance of not knowing what we used to have, or scared of thinking, well, they're just going to call us slave owners.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's it. That's what they use to kind of keep people away from bringing up anything about the South or states' rights. I think they'll immediately paint them as supporters, either racist or slave owners. And that's a tactic they've been able to use for a long time.
Well, speaking of state rights, you had we'll get into the cool part. 1861, the state of Georgia declared itself a Catholic nation. How many times you see online, everyone wants to be a Catholic nation. We want a Catholic monarch. You even you argue the point that the South was going for a decentralized monarchy.
Right, yeah.
Explain that to the people whose practice without going, do what?
Yeah, well, I don't think that it would have ended up in a monarchy. I think there was those trends, but what we were talking about a second ago, the Reformation and the Enlightenment definitely affected American thinkers, and I believe it affected North and South, but time in those philosophies and kind of the separation of church and state in a way, and getting away from a Christendom and having the state and the church separate, those sort of ideas that a lot of Protestants brought on, those in the South are saying, look at what it's leading to. It's leading to some pretty awful stuff. And we need to get back to a form of Christendom and definitely hierarchy and democracies leading to the destruction of liberty. And so you had a movement in the South, especially right on the eve of the Civil War and into the Civil War, to get away from a lot of those aspects of that had created America in the first place. And they're trying to get back to a more medieval, feudal aristocracy is what I think it would have ended up. A lot of the states started implementing, either bringing back or implementing even stronger voter restriction. And they moved more towards an aristocracy and hierarchy. And there was a movement from some that wanted Lee King, or they wanted some form of monarchy in the South. But I definitely think it'd be much more accurate to say that it'd be a conservative, libertarian sort of aristocracy rather than a monarchy. But there were those trends in there that people are saying, we need to kind of scrap the whole thing, go back to the monarchies that existed before King George of sorts, that resembled a lot of the medieval period of kingship, and implement that in the South.
Good you brought up George, because you say in there that the Declaration never condemned monarchy, just said that he wasn't the right one. Right.
Yeah, and there's that famous South Carolina pastor, Jonathan Mayhew, I think it was, that said King George has unkinged himself. And I talk about in monarchy how that's not that's a perfectly medieval kingship view. It's not anti-monarch or anti-monarchy. It's just anti that king, because he's not operating as he should be. And so we had the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, but I think, that was a movement more towards democracy and republic, obviously. And I think as time went on, the South saw some of the negatives of that and said, okay, we need to take some of the good that we've done and restore a lot of the stuff that we got rid of and move back towards a Christendom and an aristocracy.
That was part of the CSA Constitution was, all right, we saw some screw ups in that Constitution. Let's fix that.
Yeah.
There was no Supreme Court because it's so decentralized.
Yep.
You had one president for 6 years. Obviously, like I said, the slave trade was banned, outlawed. And they made it so that the states can do whatever they want. They want to ban something, they want to ban it. It's not up for the centralized authority, which the problem with today is, man, I can't wait for DC to make another edict. And I'm like, really? Call ourselves mini Russia, USSR Junior, and then enjoy whatever they come down with you. And when the other team comes down, enjoy that too.
And that's why the Confederate Constitution was definitely a reaction to the Republican Party. They said, okay, well, here's everything the Republican Party's seeking to accomplish, which do the opposite, which add more protections to prevent that from occurring. And obviously it was much more decentralized as well. And they were moving away from, as Alexander Stevens said, from the presidential election, because all our elections today have all the corruption and negatives of it, but you could see in the Constitution, and I think they would have moved further to, maybe even more less elections, as some were asking for somewhat kind of a royal family of sorts because, of the negatives that campaigns bring in. And so it's definitely a movement away from modern America. It would have prevented what's going on in many ways.
And it wasn't perfect. I mean, you even you're actually the first writer I think I saw that brings up that Georgia and North Carolina thought about breaking away from the CSA over, and what was it, the conscription laws? Conscription,
yeah. And I forget what the other issue was, but yeah, I mean, that's a big one, conscription. And that's why I think it was North Carolina that nullified the federal conscription, said, you can't do this, this is not your jurisdiction. And then they implemented a state draft or conscription. So they did the same thing, but they said, you're not allowed to do this. Only the state representatives can. We're going to nullify what you've done because the federal can't do that. But then we're going to do the same thing because we agree with it because we're fighting this war. So.
Which, hey, state, the feds don't, or wherever centralized government does not have the authority, but the state does. They call it the militia or the National Guard. I mean,
so even if we agree with you, we're still going to protect states' rights because that's the most important thing. And that's another thing to bring up because the Constitution was created by the Cotton States. The Upper South weren't even involved in Montgomery, Alabama. So they created a document that's very decentralized and strong states' rights. So if they left only to preserve slavery, they wouldn't have had to do that. It obviously shows that the states' rights were an issue in decentralization because they implement in their constitution to change in the Confederacy, which was made up of all slave states. And so if people say they left only to protect slavery, then why would they even change the constitution and become more decentralized? It was obviously on their mind and what they were concerned about.
And there were guys at the 1790s saying that this thing wasn't going to last because the two different cultures, the Northeast and the Southeast. The culture here was, what is a nation? A nation is a group of people with the same culture, same language, it's not just one thing in a continent that makes a nation. Here in North Carolina, we have nothing like whatever people in Oregon has. Different language, different culture, different customs, all that. It's different people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why back then it's not as a big a deal the way they looked at the Union. It's not like, oh, we're stuck in this thing, we're going to have to fight a civil war to get out. Their mindset is the people of the state are still sovereign. We're in this Union compact. We don't think it's going to work out because we have different interests and the people are different. It's like, it's not that big a deal. We'll go back to being our own sovereign state or maybe join with other states. There's the Middle Confederacy that almost formed in 1860 as well that included free and slave states joining together. There's a lot of antebellum America. There's a lot of instances and movements of secession of different sections of the Union. We weren't thought of as everyone's under control of DC and this is one nation. We're forced all together. None of the states would have ratified the Constitution if that were so. No, it was a union that they voluntarily joined, that they could get out. They maintained their sovereignty and could get out. And that's North and South free and slave states that spoke that language before.
Yeah, exactly. Especially since they just did the exact same thing in Britain. If
Right.
that same mindset, exactly what happened. We leave in England because we're not bound to be in that union, that marriage anymore. We're leaving it. And then 60 years later, it's like, oh no, we can't do that. We the Chode's book that you talk about, I guarantee everyone that watches this thing had no idea about the Union League,
right?
Which was the quote unquote original KKK,
right? Yeah.
Explain a little bit. He's a New Yorker.
Is he? Okay. You sent. Yeah. That's right. You sent that video. That was shocking to me. I wanted to do a chapter on Reconstruction, and I was going to do some articles, and my interest just kind of moved on. But I think Chodes and DiLorenzo do a great job in Reconstruction. But the Union League really is the first terrorist organization. It's just aimed at the civilians, and the things that the Southerners were put through. I mean, we still do the same thing today, but Jefferson said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And they would lay on these heavy taxes on especially the former plantation owners and other Southerners. And they just make it unaffordable that they couldn't live there. So they'd have to sell the land. They'd buy it up really cheap, give it to their friends. And then they'd just take over the economy. And they were kicking all these people off the land. They were abusing them, threatening them, taking away they had no political rights. They had no freedom. They were being terrorized in many ways. And so the original Ku Klux Klan was a reaction to that. The original Ku Klux Klan was not the white supremacist group from 1920. That was the
started like Illinois or Indiana.
They were against carpetbaggers who were really starving out the South and doing illegal things that if we did it in Native Americans, we teach it in schools as this horrible things that the Northerners did, which they did, but we're silent when they do it to the Southerners. And we talk about the KKK arising, but not as a reaction to the abuse that Southerners were suffering from.
Yeah, there were stories.
It was trying to prevent the abuses that were happening to innocent people in the South.
Yeah, there were stories of governors handing out matches because it was cheap and just telling this group to just go burn it down. Where I'm in Gaston County, he said, well, 8 farms were burnt down. And the reason why they burnt the farms was so that that's where their seeds were kept, their tools were kept, their food was kept.
Yeah.
Well, you would start. It was an ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
In a sense.
And definitely a political structure. Like I said, the planter class, the aristocrats of the South, that was kind of the main aim of Reconstruction in the Civil War, is to remove them from power and from society. And it happened. And that's how they've, that mixed in with education, which really started public education in occupied Southern territory and Reconstruction, is how they've changed the mindset of many Southerners and in the North.
There was a book I got back in print, the Catholicity in Georgia and South Carolina. And it gets into Sherman's March, and it was a contemporary priest that wrote the book. And the first target of Sherman in Columbia, South Carolina, was the Ursuline Convent. And they heard that he was on the way, and they made a procession cross and hand into the cemetery to hide until he left. And the number 2 target was the prisons, because they said that's where the masses were being said.
Wow.
Yeah, he's the guy, the author. He's buried at Belmont Abbey. Now, there's a bush on top of his grave, but I've seen the site. But it's again. I mean, it's because I think Sherman. I think Red Republican book. Like Kennedy, I think he brings up that Sherman was a card holding communist. Because people always want to bring up the Masons. These guys communism was here long before.
Right.
1920s, 1930s, right. Talking about it, or the 50s.
Yeah, and that's a problem I have with the Republican Party today, is I don't think they realize they've accepted a lot of the communist thought and politics. They just reject the more progressive, newer aspects of it, I guess, and don't realize how much it's influenced the Republican Party since 1860.
Well, on that point, you got with the Democrat, because people always put this one meme up. The Democrats did this. No, the Democrat Party back then was the conservative party. The Democratic Party now, that's gone. That's long gone.
Right.
Yeah, DED dead. The ones with that name now is not that, but the GOP from now is the same GOP that started that, because that was a fledgling get together type deal then.
Yeah, that's what I said for sure, is that the Republican Party really hasn't morphed that much from 1860. They've stayed the same, so they now appear like the conservative party because the modern Democrat Party is,
so bad,
so progressive that they've just kind of switched. But yeah, the old Democrat Party was really abolished with the South. R.L. Dabney wrote in the New York Times that I quote in the book at some point, and he talks about American conservatism and Northern conservatives, and it's the Republican Party. And he's objecting, saying they're not really conservative. The Southerns were conservatives. At this time, they couldn't vote during Reconstruction, so the South is gone. So the only conservative force, as it's called, is the Republicans in the North. And he said these are fake progressives. They're slow burn progressives. And that's the conservative party that we still have today. I talk about in Monarchy as well. And it's a shame that we don't have a real conservative party in America.
So if someone goes up to you and says, where's your source? I think you have it in there. If you want sources to contact you, you'll give them the sources, right?
Yeah. I've had a few people email me if they want to email me. I don't know. I think I have in the back of the book, Isaac C. Bishop 553@yahoo.com. You could also email me at jackson18611096@gmail.com. And I help people if they're into a particular source, hunt it down. I have a few that are thrown together a biography for me, so I'll include that at some point.
Since you brought it up, why did you create said Isaac Bishop?
On that, I had 4 kids living in Vermont. It was during like all the Black Lives Matter stuff was going on a few years ago when I published. But it was for my kids' safety in a way, and I didn't want them. I think one of them was in public school at the time, maybe 2. We've homeschooled all except for one. They're now in Christian school, but I didn't want them having negative influence, like their teachers hearing, "Oh, his dad wrote this book defending Dixie's land." And so it was more avoiding negative effects. Now that my kids are more grown up, I associate, like if you read my biography on Amazon, the author will say Jeb Smith, and I associate it now. I'm not.
You don't want blowback.
Yeah, and I'm not as concerned. Vermont, like I said, the stuff people say about Southerners here, the assumptions is so bad, is so prejudiced, is so off base, but it's still in the mindset of many Vermonters. And I talk about that in the book. Like if they said that about Black people, what a huge outroar it would cause. They had those false assumptions and beliefs about Southerners. And so it's not exactly a way to make friends to be associated with that. But now I'm at the point where the kids are older. It's like, I don't care.
I think I got it. I think it's in Reconstruction. I got Kennedy's book on Reconstruction over there. It brings up this, was it a Mississippi congressman that was someone they brought down to take over the state house? And his first 2 weeks later, he makes a speech saying, "What I was told about you people is not what I see about you people. Everything I was told up there is the opposite of how I've been treated, whatever. You guys have been outstanding, and what they have been lying about what you guys are."
And that's one thing I love to do, because especially among liberals in Vermont, they see the South as, the devil in a lot of ways. And so I always love, if the conversation comes up about Southerners, or when I went to Virginia or North Carolina, I was like, "Oh, they're the nicest people in the whole world." And I'll talk about all these differences, and just to kind of see their reaction or how they handle someone who's actually been to the South and seen them and has a different perspective than that mindset of pure evil that they have.
You see that as a prototype to a lot of after. You have to demonize the people down here. They're carpet dragging, knuckle dragging Neanderthals that hate they're a bunch of at that time, that period of time, everybody was racist. The abolitionists they didn't like slavery, but they hated the people that were enslaved. They didn't want to live anywhere near them.
Yeah. It's like
so it wasn't like these guys were godly or anything like that. I mean, the Battle Hymn of the Republic is literally written as some lady Unitarian that saw the glory of the coming of the Lord as Sherman burning down people's property and killing them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's rough. What was I going to mention? I love the same thing about slavery. That's why we Yanks have been fooled. I think I have as a little section title, and it's that private from New Hampshire writing home to his family in 1862. I think he's in Louisiana, and he said, "Now that I've observed slavery firsthand, I have to tell you it's the exact opposite of everything we've been told." And he writes some more, and he says, "We Yanks have been fooled," and that's why I love the writings of those Northerners who get the idea about the South or about slavery, and then they go down and see it, and it's the opposite. And the same thing applies today with the people of the South.
Hey, you bring up even laws. I mean, there was a Josephine that was accused of killing the baby and ended up multiple court cases. It wasn't like there was just this kangaroo court. Oh yeah, she's going to trial. They did everything they could to free her.
Yeah.
And that was Louisiana. I don't know if there was one in Florida.
Mississippi. That was Mississippi. I know I cite multiple Confederate state constitutions that say slaves had the same rights, slave women and slave men, over concerns of murder and rape and things like that as free white people. And so on the serious crimes, they were treated completely evenly and held up in court as well.
I forget about I don't think it's in there, but John Iredell of North Carolina. It was Iredell County is named after him. If anybody's watching from North Carolina, during the 3/5 compromise, that was the North. They didn't want any votes, and Iredell talked about was it the quote of these people, black people, are made in the image and likeness of God with human souls. Right. They are not but they are not beneath. This is almost verbatim. They are not beneath us, white. Right. They are human beings made in the image and likeness of God with human souls. Whereas the North, we're looking at them as pretty much like a Unitarian type deal thing. They're just property to be owned and do whatever you want with.
Right. Yeah. And
different mindset.
I think it was a pastor, South Carolina, who said, "We are not ashamed to call him our brother," because these Northern writers were saying that they were, I don't know, it seemed like some sort of, lesser evolved species. And he's saying, it's clear from the Bible, it's clear from our interaction. They had the Holy Spirit in them. We are not ashamed to call him our brother. Even though they're slaved up north, it's like they don't want to be associated as our brother. I mean, certain sections at least are like, no way, blacks and whites are completely different and keep us segregated. In the South, they're like, no, this is our brother and made in the image of God.
Yeah, the intermingling in the streets, shaking hands, living together, going to churches together, fighting together. They would actually. People are like, oh no, they weren't ever fighting. There's plenty of reports that they would go out with their master and fight with them against, because they're entering their homeland. That was invasion. They were destroying their home, and that was their home.
Right. Yeah, they're not thinking this is some war about setting us free, and the South is fighting to preserve them, because they're there. They don't see it that way at all, and they're fighting with their friends, their family, and they don't particularly like the North as much as we're told that they do, or that they did. Southern blacks, they didn't like the North very much either.
Well, if anybody has any questions, that's why I did the live thing. If somebody has some questions, bring it up, and we'll have them answer it. But Defending Dixie's Land is the book. I promise you, this will not. You will be impressed of it. You even got extreme applauding from Clyde Wilson. When I saw that, going, this is going to be dark on solid. Clyde was saying that.
Yeah, that review was great for sure. I helped a lot. That really got it out there, I think, when he endorsed it. And the way he put it, too, I've done over 200 book reviews in my lifetime, and I've never say, you ought to buy this book. He said, I'm using it now. You ought to buy this book. And that was, it kind of just exploded from there. So,
yeah, Clyde's a must reader. And then for him to say yours is a must read, that was like, wow, that's a solid endorsement there.
Yeah.
But I'll have it underneath in the show notes again, the link, Defending Dixie's Land. Again, you're talking about a book that brings up You got people who type on in the Catholic X or Catholic Twitter. We want a Catholic monarchy. There were actually states that were Georgia. You bring that up. The state constitution, 1861. We are a Catholic nation, or not Catholic. We're a Christian nation. I mean, they use those words. I guess that was another. What is something for people down the road to see this information? What do you want them to get out of it? What can be done about it moving forward? I look at it going, knowledge is power. You see what, hey, this was done before. We can have this again.
Right.
Kind of like in traditional ways when people were talking about wanting to turn back the clock to the the Vatican II haters go, we can turn back to pre-Vatican II times. We can do that too with this. We just get the right people mindset into places of local state, county seats, state boards, school boards, and get that mindset of the Southern conservatives way. That could happen.
Yeah, I mean, my main thing in this book was to prove that the winner writes the history, and so that's the main thing. As far as a movement, I think it'd have to happen at local levels, state and county levels, and you have to get these people, like you said, mindset. If people realize how much has changed in what Lincoln and what our federal government has done to our ability to self-govern, to our Christian nation, imposing modern secularization and centralization on us, I think that's going to ignite some anger and put some movement in people to go into get the right people at the local level and maybe start something. I mean, you don't have to have the whole South secede. You have to start it in some area. It's going to make the news. It's going to catch on and cause other movements in that direction. But if you find out that the government we have today has been really illegally stolen from us and taken from the people and placed into DC and the political parties, that should upset a lot of people. And seeing the end results of what it's brought us culturally and religiously over the last 100 or so years, I think hopefully will cause enough people to do something.
Just someone's already asked, and you actually bring this up in the book a couple of times during the slave narratives, because I think you were getting that way, going, I have to bring this up because I almost text you up going, man, this sounds actually much better than what we live today. Are we justifying chattel slavery? Anywhere in there? Is that being
not at all? And I hopefully I made that clear, because I say it a few times. I'm not for slavery in any sort of form, but as I said, we can condemn slavery as an institution, but we don't have to lie about it, exaggerate it, only tell the worst of it. We can look at how it actually existed in the South, and I think it was very unique in the way the interaction was and the way slaves were treated, and say, okay, there's some good in this bad situation. Yeah, bringing good out of evil is something, that God does in the Bible over and over. So we don't have to say the whole thing is good or the whole thing is bad. We can say slavery is bad, but it doesn't mean everything that occurred in that situation is awful.
I think you bring that up too. So what happened in the southern areas, which only 20% or less even had any. Most people worked in the fields anyways, but it wasn't like European one. It wasn't like the Caribbean one. It wasn't South American style. Those African, Asia, Chinese, those type of slaves. There's no reports of slaves being built in the Great Wall of Dixie. You look at a comparison of the two. Again, not justified, but one was treated way better than pretty much the rest of the planet, right?
Yeah, and I'd say the same thing about us. We're free today, but we're treated worse than slaves were in some ways by the government today, that we're more enslaved even though we're technically free. But yeah, that's one of the sections. And it originated from Kennedy in his book on myths of American slavery, and I built on that some. But nowhere in the entire world were blacks as well maintained, kept their population boom, their nutrition, the amount of hours they worked, the medical care they received, their happiness, everything in the southern states of slavery was better compared to any country in Africa or where they resided anywhere in the world, including the free blacks in the North, who struggled mightily compared to the southern slaves.
I think you brought that up. They ate like 4,000 calories a day, worked less hours than the people in the North. Went fishing in the middle of the day. Again, when I heard that, I'm going, okay. Again, these were the slave narrative. So again, not justifying, but I'm going, raise your hand if you're an 8 to 5 worker, you don't get home till Sunday dinner, that you would like, hey, you know what? I'd take some fishing in the middle of the day. I mean, you're almost like
you're with your family, you're with your community. You know, you don't have all the other hassles after work that we do. I mean, they're pretty much free once work's done. Like they said, they start singing, dancing. So, you know, living that sort of life because everything else was taken care of them by their master, and they didn't have all the inconveniences and worries of modern life as well.
I guess people think, oh well, they could do whatever they want. Well, if they did something bad, as in the owner did something bad to the worker, then you probably didn't get a lot of production out of them.
Right.
You lost money. You lost your, whatever you spent. Now you got to treat for other things, and then you're just. It's almost like an ignorant idea to, well, the other guys did it because they were their enemies of war or something. So you just, or Native Americans, it would enslave, cannibalize. Everyone hears about the pyramids down in Mexico, rip their hearts out of the slaves. You didn't hear, again, it's just the mindset of down this area. Again, it was a war against Christianity in a sense. Mm-hmm. They had to demonize the people. You don't hear that. You actually hear some people defending some Aztecs sometimes. But you never hear them defend people. John C. Calhoun, slave owner. Patrick, slave owner. Washington, Jefferson, slave owner. Lee, you always have to put that in there.
Right. Yeah.
You don't hear Cortez, or not Cortez. You don't hear Macahumna of the Aztec tribe, slave owner. You don't hear that.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. And that's because I think it's too close to history, the Civil War, that they don't want anything rising up again. They don't want people thinking or having the political system they did in the South or the resistance to the federal government, whereas, an ancient Aztec pagan tribe is not so much a threat. They don't have to be demonized the way the South does to ensure no one, don't look here, shove that in the closet. It's dark, it's evil. We'll peek in there, tell you how bad it is, shut the door, and don't come back. And I think that's what they do with the South.
I'm still working on Jeb to call it the War for Southern Independence.
I know that is going to be tough, and that's I guess growing up in Vermont. To me, it's the Civil War. My original interest was the military aspects, and so I just I didn't know anything much about the politics behind it or really put any thought into it. So the Civil War is this series of battles by Jackson and Lee in the North, and that's kind of just stuck in there. Politically, I agree with the label, war between the states or
not bringing this up, but you brought up, you mentioned how Stonewall was very liking of the Catholic religion, but didn't come over because he didn't agree with a couple things. Jefferson Davis was taught by Dominicans, and how a lot of people in the South had the writings of Thomas Aquinas and the Imitation of Christ.
Right.
How'd you find that? How'd you come to find that out? One, and then two, I go, that throws a lot of, again, wait a minute, these guys, Jefferson Davis was taught by Dominicans, hence why, and then on top of that with the Italians, with the North and Italy going after and imprisoning Pius IX, he probably saw the same thing that was going on in Italy going on over here and found a friend in Davis.
Yeah. No, yeah, I believe it. The Stonewall Jackson, I had a great interest in Stonewall as a general. I still think he's the best general of the war. So I read a lot of biographies. I think it was Robertson that kind of went into detail about when he was in the war in Mexico, and he kind of fell in love with the Catholic Church and the tradition and the people and how devout they were. And he really considered joining, and he almost wanted to join, and he loved the history. But in the end, there's a couple of theological reasons why he said, I don't think this is what the Bible is teaching, and I have to go this way. And so he didn't end up converting. And I said how I do think that is was common among the South, that they had a lot of respect for, in one of the chapters I mentioned, a lot of historians who make the connections between somewhat the high church in the South and their perspective, traditional and the rejection of modernity, and how they were aligned in a lot of ways with the Catholic Church, at least in the structure and in the ideals of the church, if not theologically everywhere. So it kind of just fit in. Pope Pius, I don't remember where. I think it was Adam Tate maybe that I cited that.
Yeah.
Pius's connection and kind of affirming the Confederacy.
Yeah, I mentioned it probably about 20 minutes ago about that, but just him writing. People don't know that Pius sent him the crown of thorns to Davis when he was in prison. Going, why? No one ever asked why that happened. Yeah. Like Alexis de Tocqueville writing. I always heard that about Alexis de Tocqueville saying about the South, and never had. Well, how did that happen? No one. They just assume, they read it and they go, well, that don't make any sense because I'm told this, question everything type deal. And anybody's listening, well, you don't believe the source. All right, question it. Look it up yourself. I mean, Jeb did. He went from one way to the other.
Definitely eye-opening, for sure. I think the Civil War is a great example of the winner writes the history.
Oh, yeah. Via victors. Woe to the conquered.
Yeah. It's been a very I think everything I learned about the Civil War helped me question other things as well, going to other periods of history. Because I'm like, well, if this wasn't taught right, I wonder if other things are. And it kind of just opens up your mind to critical thinking. Things are not always as they seem.
No, that's for darn sure. Well, Jeb, appreciate your time. I know I could probably do this for about 4 or 5 hours easily, and we barely skimmed some of the books. So get the book again. It's be linked underneath in the show notes. There's the Amazon again. As of today, 11th March, he is #1 in Antebellum Books. Which congrats on that. I don't know if you get a bonus or anything for that, but that's cool to hear. See, any parting thoughts on it?
No, if anyone has any questions, you can contact me through those emails. I love to discuss this stuff. Get the book if you're interested. Share it with your friends. Let them know the information. Maybe get something going. A restoration of some form of Christendom would be great. And I want to mention, I think that's what Catholics have that mindset more than Protestants. Protestants definitely separate church and state more in their mind, and they think Catholics kind of do it as a unified whole and seek a Christendom, which is why they definitely prefer the South over the secular North.
I guess another way of saying, look at this and use it as a blueprint in a way to get back. You're not going to use with the current tools.
Right. Yeah. It's not going to come through the national party, I think. No. It doesn't mean you don't vote nationally, but if you want to really seek change, it has to happen locally at this point. It's too ingrained in DC and the parties are too corrupted. It has to be a local movement. Right.
It's 100,000%. Jeb, appreciate your time, man. And we'll talk soon. We'll come up with another topic down the road.
Thank you, sir.